Welcome to our next discipleship class. So we left off last time listening to Dr. Dan Wallace, and he had explained the work that he's doing currently with the cataloging of manuscripts. So he's going to talk about one of the earliest copies of the gospel in this clip here. Play this for
The
you.
earliest fragments that the Institute in Münster has cataloged so far come from the 2nd century. Perhaps the oldest fragment is papyrus number 52, also known as John Ryland's papyrus number 457, and this is housed at the John Rylands Library of Manchester University in England. It was discovered in 1934 by C.H. Roberts, who was a man recently doctored. Got his PhD in papyrology and in classics. And he was rummaging around in the library of the John Rylands and discovered this fragment that is no larger than the palm of my hand, 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches. And the interesting thing about this fragment was it was written on both sides. What that told him almost immediately, it was probably a Christian fragment. The reason is, if it's written on both sides, then it would have been written on a codex, which is our modern book form, invented at the end of the 1st century AD. A codex where you bind it on one side, then you have cut pages that you flip, as opposed to the roll or the scroll that all other books at the time had been written on. And so this is written on both sides. And John 18:31 through 33 was on one side, John 18:37 and 38 on the other. 90 years earlier than when C.H. Roberts discovered this fragment, in 1844 in the journal The Tübinger Jahrbuch, F.C. Bauer of Tübingen University had argued that John's Gospel cannot be dated any earlier than AD 160, and most likely was to be dated about AD 170. He was basing this on philosophical constructs that he had learned from his professor of philosophy, Hegel, who had come up with Hegelian dialectic, which we may know as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so through a convoluted philosophical construct, Bauer argued John's Gospel can't be dated any earlier than 160 and probably 170. And through that approach of bringing Hegelian dialectic into New Testament studies, what happened was European scholar after European scholar for the next 90 years started to late date the Gospel of John. Obviously, if it's in the second half of the 2nd century, then it has no eyewitness credibility to it, and so its historical reliability was completely dashed. But then when Roberts discovers this small fragment, he gets it published in 1935 after he had sent photographs of it to the 3 leading papyrologists in Europe at the time. Each one of them wrote back to him and said, this manuscript cannot be dated any later than AD 150 and should be dated closer to AD 100. A fourth demurred. He said, no, I think this should be dated in the 90s of the 1st century. So you have these scholars who are saying the copy of John's Gospel can't be dated later than 150. It's probably closer to 100. Typically, we date that at about 125 now, but really it's a date between 100 and 150. But here's the interesting thing. Generally speaking, a copy of a manuscript is not written before the original of the document. This sent 2 tons of European scholarship to the flames and brought John's Gospel back into the 1st century. And with that and the Dead Sea Scrolls and some other things that have occurred in the last few decades, now we're beginning to see that John's Gospel has historical credibility.
So that's important because in looking at some of the older fragments and things from Qumran, which we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls, certainly provide us a lot of historical foundation for dating many of the New Testament scrolls. So from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, this quote, the fragments were found in a cave that had previously been identified as containing material from 50 BC to 50 AD. The scholar who first identified these early fragments as New Testament books was Jose O'Callaghan, a noted Spanish paleographer. The New York Times recognized the implications of O'Callaghan's theory by admitting that if it is true, it would prove at least one of the Gospels, that of St. Mark, was written only a few years after the death of Jesus. So this is really how the information is laid out for the caves. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but notice it says O'Callaghan eventually identified 9 fragments. The center column in the following chart uses the numbering system established for manuscripts. For example, 7Q5 means fragment 5 from Qumran Cave 7. So you can see here that there are a number of very, very early manuscripts represented for Mark's Gospel and Acts, not to mention, Paul's and Peter's and James' writing. So the testimony of the scrolls give us that there are better New Testament manuscripts. And this is kind of a little bit of a rehash from last week, but we have a 98 to 99+% accuracy in the New Testament. Most other books are 90 to 95% accuracy. This is the Mahabharata. This is a Hindu document. It's about 90% accuracy of content. The Iliad of Homer is about 95%, and the New Testament is 99+. This is out of every piece of historical literature that is in existence. So this puts things in perspective for us. Now, here's from the testimony of the early church fathers. Now, these are people that, as you can see, the names up here, these are people that were leaders in the church after the apostles. So we get a lot of information. They have divided the writings of church fathers from before and after the Nicene Council in 325. So you have the Ante-Nicene Fathers, which is prior to 325, the Post-Nicene Fathers, which is after 325. So these would be Ante-Nicene Fathers. And notice it says, in letters written between 95 and 110, 3 early church fathers, Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp, quoted passages out of 25 of the 27 books of the New Testament. Since Clement was in Rome and Ignatius and Polycarp were hundreds of miles away in Smyrna, the original New Testament documents had to have been written significantly earlier, otherwise they could not have circulated across the ancient world by that time. Therefore, it's safe to say that all of the New Testament was written by AD 100, and at least those in the left column several years before 95. And that's in right around the time that John the Apostle would have died, near the end of the 1st century. So nothing went in after his death. So here's also a list of citations for the New Testament based on the writer. On the left you have these church fathers, and then you have the number of quotes out of each of the references in the New Testament, and then you have the total being 36,289. So this includes really probably a little more than half of the New Testament that you can construct simply from their writings, the verses that they copied out of the New Testament.
When you think about the comparison in terms of the number of copies we have for the Gospels versus other ancient documents, I can say in general that the copies we have of the Gospels are far, far more numerous than any other thing we have in the Greco-Roman world, including Homer, which comes in a distant second. And I'm splitting that between the Odyssey and the Iliad. We have, as I've mentioned, about 5,800 manuscripts in Greek of the New Testament. Most of those are going to have Gospels or part of the Gospels in them. Then we have other ancient translations of the New Testament, beginning with Latin in the 2nd century. We have about 10,000 copies of Latin. Again, most of those are of the Gospels, and then they'll have other portions as well. We have Coptic, Syriac, Georgian, Gothic, Old Church Slavonic, Armenian, Arabic, Aramaic, numerous languages, and those languages, not counting the Latin, come to at least 5,000, probably more than 10,000 copies. So when you gather all this material together, for the whole New Testament or portions of the New Testament, we've got at least 20,000 copies of the New Testament in some form of these ancient languages. If you were to wipe all those out, and you had a magic wand, you could just destroy all of them in one fell swoop, we'd still be able to reproduce virtually the entire New Testament just from the writings of the church fathers alone, because they commented on the New Testament and they did not have the gift of brevity. And so these church fathers, we have over 1 million quotations of the church fathers from the New Testament. Once again, the Gospels are the primary things that they quote from. Now, let's compare that to just the average classical author. The average classical Greek or Latin author has fewer than 20 copies of his writings still in existence. Far fewer, typically. Sometimes 1 or 2. Sometimes we have such massive gaps that somebody will mention, I've written these 35 books and we only have 18 of them, or only 4 of them left in existence. Sometimes we're waiting 1,000 years before we see our earliest copy. But let's say the average classical author has 20 copies, to be on the very generous side. You stack those up, they'll be about 4 feet high. Stack up the New Testament manuscripts in the various languages, not counting the patristic quotations, and the stack would be more than a mile high. So the comparison, there is no comparison. It's just a massive disparity. What you're dealing with classical literature is a dearth of evidence. What you're dealing with the New Testament is an embarrassment of riches.
The question of whether we can be confident that we have reconstructed documents extremely close to the originals that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would have originally produced is another place where there's a lot of misinformation in society. Textual critics of all or no theological perspectives agree that with all the New Testament documents, and particularly with the Gospels, we can go back with a high degree of confidence to documents as early as the 2nd century, which may well have been copied directly from the manuscripts that were the first editions, if you like, of the 4 Gospels. And that as these texts emerge, we have larger and larger fragments preserved until, as we move into the 3rd century, we have nearly complete Gospels, and in the 4th and 5th centuries, nearly complete New Testaments. These represent amounts of evidence for which no other document or collection of documents anywhere in the ancient world enjoys. It's a luxury of evidence. And so while none of this proves that what the gospel writers were saying was necessarily all true, it certainly is more than adequate to show we know what their original claims were.
And that's the important piece. We know that what was transmitted was correct. So Daniel Wallace said this, to quote him, "The wealth of material that is available for determining the wording of the original New Testament is staggering. More than 5,700 Greek New Testament manuscripts, as many as 20,000 versions, and more than 1 million quotations by patristic writers. In comparison with the average ancient Greek author, the New Testament copies are well over 1,000 times more plentiful. If the average sized manuscript were 2½ inches thick, all the copies of the world of an average Greek author would stack up 4 feet high, while the copies of the New Testament would stack up to over a mile high." And this is what was quoted earlier. This is indeed an embarrassment of riches. So the reason I wanted to reiterate what Dan Wallace said was because the amount of disparity between what is available for the New Testament and every other piece of ancient historical literature, it's not even in the same galaxy. So how do we know what we have is accurate? That's a great question. So like Bloomberg said, it was certainly copied accurately, but does it tell the truth? But we do know that we had earlier manuscripts, 25-year gap versus 1,000-year gap to the original, right? More than 5,600 versus 10 to 20, and that's really more like 5,800 today. More accuracy in them being copied, and then more abundantly supported manuscripts because we have them by church father quotations as well as non-Greek manuscripts. And again, that 1,800 is even larger. So Bart Ehrman, who is agnostic, atheist, New Testament scholar, he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus, and he actually agrees with the reliability as far as transmission. Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him, he said, because he was both my inspiration for going into textual criticism and the person who trained me in the field. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him, and even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian, and I am not. We are in complete disagreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. But even Ehrman knows that though he doesn't believe what was copied was telling the truth, he believes they were copied accurately. He goes on, he says, if he, in other words, talking about Metzger, and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text in the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript edition of the New Testament. So this is what he says, right? So he doesn't believe that the New Testament is at odds, like it says here, does not actually stand at odds with Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants. In other words, any kind of variation in the New Testament text is not going to alter anything that we believe as Christians. There's not enough indication of that for change in any of the text. Like we said, we know what it actually says. So, how could you know the original had been altered unless you knew what the original said? This is part of the problem with Ehrman's thesis, right? So, you have to know what the original actually says in order to know what's altered, and which means you'd have the original. So this is part of the problem. Again, we get back to our first couple of points of knowing the truth, self-contradictory statements, right? And then about 80% of variance is spelling with no change in meaning. We saw that, and we'll see it again. Only 1% affect any meaning, and none affect any significant Christian doctrine. In other words, though 1% we may be a little unsure of what the verse actually should say grammatically, it's not dealing with essential Christian doctrine or belief. Number 4 holds deconstructionist view of the text. That's what Ehrman holds. In other words, he deconstructs the text. He removes the things that he believes are true in it, which puts him into a postmodern position where basically nobody can know anything about anything and nobody knows the truth. But this applies to everything but his own book. In his own book, He won't allow for deconstruction nor for postmodern thought. He wants everybody to believe his book because he thinks that what he's writing is true. This is part of the problem with that kind of thinking. So, deconstructionism, the reader determines the meaning. That's actually what it means, right? So, this is what his book looks like, but he believes that as people read the New Testament, they determine the meaning. Should I determine the meaning of that? Now we go back to point 1 and 2. The truth is absolute, the truth is knowable, right? And it's just a self-defeating statement. So he wants you to take the position that you determine the meaning when you read the New Testament, but you don't determine the meaning when you read his book. Well, how can you do that? So, this is Dan Wallace on Ehrman's view. Bart Ehrman is part of a very small minority of textual critics in what he's saying. Frankly, I don't think he has challenged his biases. I think he has fed them, and that's out of the case for the real Jesus. It cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance the text of the Bible is certain, especially in the case with the New Testament. This is Sir Frederick Kenyon. And again, we mentioned him earlier. He was the director at the British Museum in charge of ancient manuscripts. And he's since passed away, obviously. But he used to oversee all of the British Museum's huge catalog of manuscripts. So, if history can't be known, then, number one, how can evolutionists claim to know the history of life? It is spontaneously generated, and we've all evolved from the very first life by natural selection and mutation. Well, if we can't know history in dealing with the Bible, we can't know any history. Evolutionists can't know history, scientists can't know history, nobody can know any history. How can anyone be convicted of any crime? Because juries convict people on what their past wrongdoings are. So we can establish historical basis. How can anyone complain of historical revisionism or historical propaganda? One cannot detect these things without knowing the truth about history. You can't know that history has been changed unless you know what history was. Very simple concept. So when people say, well, nobody can really know that about the Bible, well, then they have to know about the Bible in order to refute that claim. How can anyone prove Christianity is false? One would need to know the historical truth to prove such a claim. In other words, you'd have to know what Christianity actually was, verifiably by history, in order to say that it is false at that point. So, the early testimony conclusion here is that the New Testament has more manuscripts, earlier manuscripts, and more accurately copied manuscripts than any other book in the ancient world. So that's the first E, early testimony. The second E is eyewitness testimony. And in the historical crosshairs of the text, now this is from Luke 3, 1 and 2. It says, now in the 15th year, and I've underlined the places for emphasis, of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and the region of Trachonitis, and Licinius, tetrarch of Abilene, while Annas and Caiaphas were high priests, the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. Now, does it sound like Luke's making up a story? He's given you an exact date. He's telling you exactly who was in reign, a number of people, what was going on. And then there are 8 people listed that are known from history. There's just no way to establish that as being anything other than an actual historical event. All were known to live at this exact time from information outside of the Bible, and this is not a once-upon-a-time story, which would be a myth. Myth takes at least a couple of generations to begin to grow, because you can't have a myth during the time that something is actually happening or within a short time afterwards, because it's too easy to dispel it. So numerous confirmed eyewitness details. In Acts, we have 84 historically confirmed eyewitness details. Luke includes, who is the writer of Acts. That's his second writing, right? His first one is the Gospel to Theophilus, and the second one was to Theophilus also, which is the book of Acts. He includes several other historical events in his Gospel, like we just read. And then John gives us 59 historically confirmed or historically reliable eyewitness details. In the New Testament documents, they cite more than 30 people confirmed by secular sources or archaeology. So these are things that now give us not only eyewitness testimony, but show that this is firsthand information, and it also lends to the credibility of the truth of what's written. So I'm not going to go through all 84 confirmed eyewitnesses, of the or the testimony of the eyewitness of Luke. You can get this, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, but I'm going to pick out a couple. The unusual but correct declension of the name Lystra in chapter 14. The proper port, Atalia, which returning travelers would use. Now, these are small details that we just read through in the text that you would have to be an eyewitness to know this type of information. The proper form of the name Troas, the right location for the river near Philippi, which is the Ganges, the proper locations, Amphipolis and Apollonia, where travelers would spend successive nights on this journey. Number 22, the use of correct Athenian slang word for Paul, as well as for the court. The Areopagites as the correct title for a member of the court. The name Tyrannus, as attested from Ephesus in the first century inscriptions. That the Ephesian theater was the meeting place of the city. Just because there was a theater there does not mean that it would be a general meeting location. The proper term for those holding court. The use of plural, perhaps a remarkable reference to the fact that two men were conjointly exercising the functions of proconsul at the time. How would they know that unless they were there? Employment of the ethnic term for Asenos, the correct name for the city as a neuter plural, right, in Patura, the appropriate route passing across the open sea south of Cyprus, favored by persistent northwest winds, the common way to obtain Roman citizenship at the time, and the tribune being impressed with Roman rather than Tarsian citizenship. Paul was from Tarsus. The name Porcius Festus, which agrees precisely with that given by Josephus, the correct legal formula, the best shipping lanes at the time, the right route to sail in view of the winds. This is when Paul was on the ship that he got shipwrecked on, the location of Fair Havens and the neighboring site of Lasea. A noted tendency of a south wind in these climbs to back suddenly to a violent northeaster, the well-known Gregale, and the precise place the name of the island, remember where they stopped, the proper term for the time for the Adriatic, and then the precise term for taken soundings and the correct depth of the water near Malta. That was the island, and the proper title, Proteus, for the man on the island that ran it, and then the conditions of imprisonment, living at his own expense. And then Luke reports a total of, and that last one should be 28, 30 to 31. So Luke reports a total of 35 miracles in the same book, in the book of Acts, in which he records 84 of these historically confirmed details. So it says, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Now, why would Luke be so accurate with trivial details like wind directions, water depths, peculiar town names, but not be accurate when it comes to important events like miracles? In light of the fact that Luke has proven accurate with so many trivial details, it is nothing but pure anti-supernatural bias to say that he's not telling the truth about the miracles he records. As we have seen, such a bias is illegitimate. This is a theistic world where miracles are possible, so it makes much more sense to believe Luke's miracle accounts than to discount them. In other words, Luke's credentials as a historian have been proven on so many points that it takes more faith not to believe his miracle accounts than to believe them. So now John has 59 that he records. Again, we'll pick out a couple. Archaeology confirms the proper place of Jacob's well. Come Down accurately describes the topography of Western Galilee. There's a significant elevation drop from Cana to Capernaum. Archaeology confirms the proper location and description of the 5 colonnades at the Pool of Bethesda. That's been excavated, and the sudden and severe squalls are common on the Sea of Galilee when they rose up quickly into storms. The 2 predominant opinions of Jesus, one that Jesus was a good man, the other that he deceives people, would not be the 2 choices John would have made up. A later Christian writer would have probably inserted the opinion that Jesus was God, but people had the opinion to both sides. That's accurate historical representation. Archaeology confirms the existence and location of the Pool of Siloam. The healed man called Jesus a prophet rather than anything more lofty suggests the incident is unembellished history. And then 15 stadia less than 2 miles is precisely the distance from Bethany to Jerusalem, and the burial wrappings of Lazarus were common for first-century Jewish burials. It is unlikely that a fiction writer would have included this theologically irrelevant detail. Caiaphas was indeed the high priest that year. We learn from Josephus that Caiaphas held the office from AD 18 to 37. Waving of palm branches was common Jewish practice for celebrating military victories and welcoming national rulers. Peter asked John to ask Jesus a question. There's no reason to insert this detail. If it is fiction, Peter could have asked Jesus himself. This was at the Last Supper. The Father is greater than I is an unlikely invention, especially if John wanted to make up the deity of Christ, as the critics claim he did. The use of the childbirth metaphor in chapter 16 is thoroughly Jewish. It has been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Jesus' admission that he had gotten his words from the Father would not be included if John were inventing the idea that Christ was God. The name of the high priest's servant Malchus, who had his ear cut off, is an unlikely invention. proper identification of Caiaphas' father-in-law Annas, who was the high priest from AD 6 to 15. The appearance before Annas is believable because of the family connection and the fact that former high priests maintained great influence. The identification of a relative of Malchus, the high priest's servant that had his ear cut off, is a detail that John would not have made up. It has no theological significance and could only hurt John's credibility if he were trying to pass off fiction as truth. A surface similar to the stone pavement has been identified near the Antonia fortress with markings that may indicate soldiers played games there, as in the gambling for Jesus' clothes. The Jews exclaiming, "We have no king but Caesar," would not be invented given the Jewish hatred for the Romans, especially if John had been writing after AD 70. This would be like New Yorkers today proclaiming, "We have no king but Osama bin Laden." After the spear was thrust into Jesus' side, out came what appeared to be blood and water. Today we know that a crucified person might have a watery fluid gather in the sac around the heart called the pericardium. John would not have known of this medical condition and could not have recorded this phenomenon unless he was an eyewitness or had access to eyewitness testimony. And Josephus in his Antiquities confirms that spices were used for royal burial. This detail shows that Nicodemus was not expecting Jesus to rise from the dead, and it also demonstrates that John was not inserting later Christian faith into the text. Mary Magdalene in chapter 20, a former demon-possessed woman, we find that in Luke 8:2, would not be invented as the empty tomb's first witness. In fact, women in general would not be presented as witnesses in a made-up story. More on this later. Mary mistaking Jesus for the gardener is not a detail that a later writer would have made up, especially a writer seeking to exalt Jesus. Jesus stating that he is returning to my God and your God does not fit with a later writer bent on creating the idea that Jesus was God. 153 fish in chapter 21, when they did their fishing in the final chapter, is a theologically irrelevant detail, but perfectly consistent with the tendency of fishermen to want to record and then brag about large catches. The cryptic statement from Jesus about the fate of Peter is not clear enough to draw a certain theological conclusion, so why would John make it up? It's another unlikely invention. When we conclude John's knowledge of Jesus' personal conversations with these nearly 60 historically confirmed, historically reliable details, is there any doubt that John was an eyewitness or at least had access to eyewitness testimony? It certainly seems to us that it takes a lot more faith not to believe John's gospel than to believe it. And this is, put in here because we heard Daniel Wallace's testimony about how they used to try to say that John's gospel was actually written later in the 2nd century, but not only does the internal evidence show that it is eyewitness detail, but the evidence from manuscripts now, as we uncover more, show that it really did come out of the 1st century. So this is a chart showing New Testament documents cite more than 30 people confirmed by secular sources or archaeology. So these are people that are named in the Bible, but are also confirmed outside of the Bible as actual people living at the time. And then you see the non-Christian source in the right column. It's a 3-column layout there that you can see. So, eyewitness testimony, historical persons in the New Testament. Here we got a list of them: Agrippa 1, 2, Annas, Ananias, Aretas, Bernice, Augustus, Caiaphas, Claudius, Drusilla, the Egyptian false prophet in Acts 21, Aratus, Felix, Gallio, and Gamaliel in Acts 5. We got Herod Antipas, Herod Archelaus, Herod the Great, Herod Philip I, Herod Philip II, Herodas, Salome, James, John the Baptist, Judas of Galilee, Licinius, Pilate, Quirinius, Porcius Festus, Sergius Paulus, Tiberius Caesar. So those are the eyewitnesses, and then now on to the 30, which is embarrassing testimony. This is interesting because it shows that New Testament writers, if they were constructing something artificial, would never have written things to embarrass themselves or show themselves in an unfavorable light, especially if you're trying to promote some religion, right? It shows that they were dim-witted. They fail to understand what Jesus is saying, and there's the references. There's a few of them right there. They were uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus twice. They make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. They're rebuked, right? Peter is called Satan. Paul rebukes Peter about being wrong about a theological issue in Galatians 2. They're cowards. Peter denies Christ 3 times. The disciples run away. The women are the brave ones, which you would not have in a normal story that you were just trying to fabricate. They're doubters, right? Despite being taught several times that Jesus would rise from the dead, and those are the verses that will give those to you, the disciples are doubtful when they hear of his resurrection. Some are even doubtful after they see him. Remember Thomas. So Jesus was considered out of his mind by his own family, who came to seize him to take him home in Mark 3. He was deserted by many of his followers in John 6:66. The only ones left were the 12 apostles. He was not believed by his own brothers, John 7. He was thought to be a deceiver in John 7:12. He turned off Jewish believers to the point they wanted to stone him. That happened a number of times, but this reference is in John 8. He was accused of being demon-possessed and mad in John 10. He was called a drunkard in Matthew 11. He was called demon-possessed, Mark 3 and John 7 and 8. He had his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute in Luke 7. And he was crucified despite the fact that anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse, from Deuteronomy 21:23. Here's Frank Turek.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
So, great presentation. You left me with enough things that I want to respond to that if I did, we would be here all night. So I'll just narrow it down.
Brian's the head of the Secular Student Alliance, so there you go. We had dinner, so
yeah.
Say hi to Brian. There you go.
Hey, SSA.
Hey, Brian. Go ahead.
So yeah, there's just a couple points I want to, focus on that really stood out to me. So you put a lot of emphasis on the embarrassing details.
Yeah.
So I have a couple points that I just want to list out real quick and then just get your response to.
Sure.
There's a number of examples in ancient mythology that of embarrassing details. Like, for example, in the account of Hercules, he has a fit of rage and kills his family. In the writings of Homer, well, not really writings, but in the works of Homer, Odysseus's men, his soldiers, are often presented as a bunch of bumbling idiots who get him in trouble. And then, of course, Josephus uses women as source material when he's writing the Jewish war, like in his account of Gamala, for example. And so I'm just wondering if we know that an ancient writer who lived in Jerusalem, or at least in Israel around the time of Jesus, who was a respected historian, used women, then doesn't that mean that women occasionally were trusted as historical sources? And then the presence of embarrassing details of characters and heroes in, like, for example, Greek mythology, doesn't that kind of...
Well, yeah, when you're talking about mythology, or just like a novel, yeah, you're going to have a lot of embarrassing details. That's what it's about. It's about making it more interesting if it's a novel.
So then my question is, how does that serve as a standard for what's historically accurate if it also occurs in mythology?
Well, because the embarrassing detail argument doesn't stand alone. It stands with all the other E's that I put up there, okay? Which shows that they're not writing mythology. They're writing what they believe to be true, and then they go and die for it.
Right. So I understand that you can build a case for the resurrection, or you can build a case for the historical reliability of the New Testament Gospels on the basis of these other criteria, but then the embarrassing detail kind of falls away, doesn't it? Because it occurs in other mythology.
Well, if it was mythology, but see, we know that Hercules or whatever you mentioned is mythology. We know that. This is being put forth as true, and these are historical characters, which, by the way, in our book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which I know you have, in chapter 10, I think it is, maybe 9, we list more than 30 historical characters in the New Testament documents that are also in secular sources and or archaeology. So this is a story about real life. It's not Homer or it's not Hercules. It's not mythology. This is put forth as being true, and then there's other evidence that it's true. As you know, being an archaeologist or somebody interested in archaeology, you know there's archaeological evidence for some of these things.
Right, but the existence, being able to verify the historical existence of a person doesn't necessarily mean that you've verified every account of every detail of their life.
You can't verify everything in the New Testament or the Old Testament. You can, but when you get enough evidence to suggest that they're telling the truth, you can take the rest of that and go, well, if they're telling the truth here, they're probably telling the truth here.
So once again, Turek makes some great points. Here's another one by him.
Have you ever lied to make yourself look good? Yeah, of course you have. Now, have you ever lied to make yourself look bad? No, you would never do that. And the principle of embarrassment goes like this. If there's something embarrassing in the text, it's probably true, because the authors would never make themselves look bad, just like you would never lie to make yourself look bad. Well, the New Testament documents are filled with embarrassing details that they never would have invented. For example, the New Testament writers depict themselves as dim-witted. They don't understand what Jesus is saying. They don't understand his mission. In fact, they don't really get his mission until he's already ascended to heaven. And then they go, wow, I could have had a V8. Up to that point, they didn't know. Peter, their leader, is called Satan by Jesus. That's embarrassing. And of course, Peter says, look, Lord, I'll never deny you. What does he wind up doing? He winds up denying the Lord 3 times. This is their leader. And then if you look in Galatians chapter 2, you see Paul rebuking Peter for being wrong about a theological issue. Why are 2 apostles arguing over theology in the Bible if they're making this up? They're not. It's embarrassing, but they're telling the truth. And then at the crucifixion, the disciples run away. Why would they run away? Why would they admit they ran away? They wouldn't. It must have really happened. And then the first witnesses at the tomb are women. Why would they invent that? In fact, in that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. So if you were making up the New Testament resurrection story, you'd only have the men be the first witnesses. Yet all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which is telling us what? They really were. They never would have invented it. Never would have invented that. In fact, I had a woman come up to me once and she said, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. And then if you look in Matthew chapter 28, verse 17, this is 2 verses before the so-called Great Commission, when Jesus is standing there and he says, go therefore, make disciples of all nations, that passage. As they're standing there, it says the disciples, some believed, but some doubted. How did that verse get in the Bible? He's already resurrected, and they're doubting it's him. Do you think they invented that? No. It's embarrassing. They're just telling the truth. There's even embarrassing details about Jesus. In Mark chapter 3, his own family thinks he's out of his mind. They want to come and seize him to take away. Jesus' family does. Now, you may have heard people say, the scholars say that the New Testament writers invented Jesus to be God. Really? Then why are they saying his own family thinks he's nuts? And he's also called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. And oh, by the way, you know there are 2 prostitutes in Jesus' bloodline? Rahab and Tamar. Do you think Matthew and Luke got together and said, you know what, I really think we need to spice up the Messiah's bloodline a little bit. Let's put a couple of prostitutes in there. No, I don't think so. They're just telling the truth as embarrassing as it is. You will never see this in a Pharaoh's bloodline. You will never see the Pharaoh being called a drunkard, being called demon-possessed, or having prostitutes in his bloodline. Any Pharaoh would chop the heads off of his historians if they ever said that, but the New Testament is telling us the truth, as embarrassing as it is. You want the ultimate no-spin zone? Read the Bible.
So that's the embarrassing testimony. So we have time for one more today. We'll do excruciating testimony, number 4. So what is that? What did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? In other words, what would be the advantage, right? They already believed they had the true religion in Judaism. Why would they risk persecution, death, and eternal damnation by defecting from Judaism? Doesn't make sense. They put themselves through an excruciating experience. They had every motive to say the resurrection did not happen, right? They had no motive to invent a new storyline. And submission, persecution, servitude, and death are not motivations to claim Jesus rose from the dead. In fact, they knew he actually did not. So if he did not rise from the dead, why would they say that he did and ruin their lives through it? That's the point. Why would they die for a known lie, right? People die for lies all the time, but they believe they're dying for something that is true. No one dies for what they know is a lie, especially in multitudes of people claiming to have seen Jesus rise from the dead. All scams break down at the point where death is a possibility because the advantage of a better, richer, more advantaged life is no longer viable, which a scam offers. But the disciples carried the claim of Jesus risen to their own deaths. Here's Turek again.
Another reason we know the New Testament writers are telling the truth is they died for it. They went through excruciating deaths to say that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. They could have saved themselves by simply saying, look, it never happened. Now, these people were Jews. They already thought they were God's chosen people. Why would they invent a resurrected Jesus? Why would they do that if it didn't happen? And then go to their deaths saying that it happened. They wouldn't. You see, many people will die for a lie they think is the truth. There are many people who will die for their religion, but they think it's true. But nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. The New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not, and they went to their deaths anyway. Why? Because they saw Jesus, they touched Jesus, they ate with Jesus. They verified with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. They were there, and they went and died for it. Remember, they're Jews. They had no motive to make this up. In fact, the New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. There would be no New Testament if Jesus had not risen from the dead. Why would Jews invent this? They wouldn't. They went to their deaths because it happened, and you can believe it as well.
So now you know where I get the 70s from. The apostles' belief and practices, this is before and after the resurrection, right? So before, they had animal sacrifice they practiced. Afterwards, they looked to Christ's sacrifice. Before, they had the binding law of Moses on their life, and afterwards, Christ's life was their example for living. They were strict monotheists, and then they believed the Trinity afterwards. Before, they operated by honoring the Sabbath day, and then they had Sunday worship afterwards. They waited for a conquering Messiah, and then afterwards they understood that he was the first coming, a sacrificial Messiah. They exercised circumcision prior to the resurrection, and baptism and communion afterwards. What would motivate disciples of Jesus to make these abrupt, drastic changes unless they knew Jesus had risen from the dead? So that's the last one. Next time, we'll jump into expected testimony, which are things we would have expected to have occurred. So this will take one more time to get through this presentation. So this is just part 2, and we'll end it here. So may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.